All right, so if you weren't already aware, this is an Envirothon workshop in the content-based training. And if you have any questions about what Envirothon is, we have this information on the slide here. And if you know what Envirothon is, hopefully you registered and you're getting ready to go for the competition. And then if you're watching this afterwards, you can also participate next year as well. And information is on the Envirothon website. But we're happy to have our participants here and excited for this year. Okay. Oh yeah, and then I'm Leica Hansen. I work with Amy at Pierce Conservation District. And I'm also on the Envirothon Team Support Subcommittee. So I'll be moderating and also presenting today. Yeah, we'll pass it over to Amy.
So hi everybody, my name is Amy and I am the Stream Team Specialist at Pierce Conservation District. Like Leica already said, I work with her there and we are going to dive into some stream ecology today. So like I said, I am the Stream Team Specialist. So what does that mean? I am part of the Water Quality Department at Pierce Conservation District. We have a volunteer program where community members all around Pierce County help volunteer and they monitor streams all over Pierce County. So what we like to focus in on in the Stream Team program with our monitors and our outreach program is we do a lot of watershed education. Like I said, we like to involve the community in citizen science or community science. Through this program, it actually allows us to increase our availability to water quality data. More monitors mean more streams, gathering data on those different parameters. With having these monitors at each different sites, it helps us to identify areas of concern in a particular stream. So if a stream's not doing very well and we have a monitor going out there every month, we can kind of pinpoint as to what's going on and contact any of our local jurisdictions for help and assistance. And then also we monitor in all 4 watersheds. We do it in the Puyallup, the Nisqually, Chambers Clover, and Key Peninsula watershed. So let's kind of dive into what a watershed is. So essentially, a watershed is an area of land that channels rainfall or snowmelt to creeks, streams, or rivers that eventually make its way to larger bodies of water, like aquifers, which are basically underground lakes, essentially. They can also channel into lakes, bays, and even the ocean. So really fun watershed activity to kind of get more of a hands-on look because watersheds are so huge. Mountains and streams are these big concepts. So it's really hard to kind of wrap our brain around how actually water flows in a watershed. So a really fun activity to do on your own in your spare time is to take a piece of paper, crinkle it up into a ball. Once you're sufficient in your crinkling method, you can actually lay it out flat. I tend to not try to lay it out completely flat. I just like to get all 4 corners pointing outwards again. And then from there, you can actually take a Sharpie. That's what I used in this picture, as you can see. And you can actually start to trace along all the little culverts and valleys that you see here. And you can actually see, if you look right here, it's very faint. So sorry that it's very faint. I should have actually Sharpied it. But you can actually see the ridge that divides the 2 watersheds. So you have one over here and one over here, and the water flows down differently. And water can actually, from the streams, it can go out to the ocean, like I said, or it can just stop and infiltrate into groundwater. So there's many different mechanisms that water can flow and move throughout a watershed. So speaking of the Pierce County watersheds, let's kind of dive into how many streams we have in each of the watersheds as a Stream Team program. So we have 9 streams in the Key Peninsula watershed. We have 12 streams in the Chambers Clover watershed. We have 4 streams in the Nisqually watershed, and then we have 13 streams in the Puyallup watershed. And out of all of those streams, we have 22 prioritized sites. And what that means is that we went to our jurisdictions like City of Gig Harbor, City of Tacoma, or City of Puyallup, and we asked them, like, hey, where do we need to be monitoring? Where do we need to kind of focus in on? And our jurisdictional partners gave us a couple different streams depending on where they were at. And that is how we accumulated 22. So we have monitors on those 22 prioritized sites every month, monitoring so that we can actually see trends and data occurring for multiple years to come. So speaking of how water moves in a system, let's kind of dive into the water cycle. And I'm sure many of you have actually seen this diagram before. It's very common, or one that's very similar to it. So in simplistic terms, the water cycle is essentially how water moves continuously from the ground to the atmosphere, back down to the ground, or a reservoir like a lake. It's really important to note that there is no new introduction of water into our system. Everything that we have currently available on Earth has been recycled and reused many different times and in many different forms. And water has three different forms that it can be in. It can be in a liquid form, a solid form, or a gas form. So let's kind of dive into the actual technical aspects of the water cycle. So we have evaporation. So as the sun beams down onto the ocean or a lake or even a stream, evaporation occurs, which then sends water vapor, that's water's gas stage, up into the atmosphere where it's a lot cooler. And so condensation actually begins to occur, and that's where you kind of form clouds. And so with clouds, that's where precipitation begins to occur. And you can have different forms of precipitation. You could have snow, which falls down onto glaciers and stays there for thousands of years, which would be water's solid form. Or you could have precipitation in the form of rain, which can run down all the hills and valleys and flow into our streams or lakes or even oceans. Or it can actually infiltrate into our groundwater or aquifers, like I mentioned before. And so as the water infiltrates in, plants that are on the land will uptake that water, and then from there, transpiration occurs. It's very similar to evaporation. Evaporation just occurs from a body of water to the atmosphere, where transpiration occurs from plants uptaking that water and then it transpiring out of them up into the atmosphere. So very similar process, just two different ways to get there. So ultimately, why should we care about streams? What is it about streams that we should care about? Well, there's many different reasons why we should care about streams. Number one, we're not the only ones that use streams, right? Our wildlife depend on our streams being healthy and flowing correctly in order to suffice their life and continue the circle of life, right? But humans also use streams as well. We use them for recreational purposes, like floating down a river in the summer, or even swimming during the summer, or let's say fishing, right? It's a food source for us. Streams can also play a really big part in our health as humans, like our physical health, mental health, and spiritual health. And you have to also think culturally with our indigenous folks around this western part of Washington. Streams are really crucial for their cultural aspect. So if they're not healthy, it's going to impact culturally on how they operate things. And then you also, when streams actually flood, they actually produce nutrients into our land. So you get that aspect as well. So this is a really fun question. Why do beavers build their homes in the middle of streams? Speaking of wildlife. So there are many different answers. You could select A, easy access to food, B, abundance of building materials, C, hate the sound of running water, D, like cool, damp places, or E, less competitive than terrestrial areas. I'm going to give you a minute to think about it for a second. Think, which one do you think why beavers build their homes in the middle of streams? And if you guessed C, hate the sound of running water, you would have been correct. Beavers actually hate the sound of running water. That's why they dam up the streams, the whole width of a stream. So how streams can actually be like a meditative source for humans and a nice calming sound, for beavers, it's like for us, that neighbor at 7 a.m. in the morning starting the lawnmower, same thing for beavers of running water. So very little fun fact you can kind of take with you and, put it into any conversation to get the conversation started. So how do we measure stream health at Pierce Conservation District, and specifically within our stream team program? There's many different ways. There's chemical, there's also biological, and then there's physical. And we're going to actually dive into the chemical right now. So there are 5 different parameters that the stream team collect chemically wise to see how the water quality is doing within a stream. So we collect for pH, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, temperature, and nitrate nitrogen. So our first off, dissolved oxygen. Basically, dissolved oxygen is basically the amount of gaseous oxygen dissolved in the water. So oxygen enters the water by absorption from the atmosphere, like rain, rapid movement from waterfalls and ripples, or as a waste product of plants who photosynthesize. So why is dissolved oxygen so important? It's because it is required by most aquatic animals and plants. And it's a phenomenal indicator of how our water is doing. It's one of the main ones that any scientist looks at to determine how healthy a stream is. So what are the factors that actually can affect dissolved oxygen and the different levels? It can temperature, turbulence, amount of aquatic plants, so photosynthesizing and respiration occurring, and then amount of decaying organic matter. These all play a hand in how dissolved oxygen levels come out as we collect those samples. Moving into turbidity. So turbidity, very simple. It's basically the measure of clarity within the water. So we have our stream team monitors. They actually carry not dissolved oxygen. They carry distilled water with them in their kits, and they fill up one of the test tubes with distilled water, and then they fill up the other one with stream water, actually. And then they can kind of compare the two, right? Distilled water is going to be your more clear one, and then that's a great comparison to whatever your stream is. And it's very easy to see the differentiating in color, but what we're really making sure to look at is the clarity of water, not the color of water. That is 2 different things. Why turbidity is so important? It's because turbidity affects the amount of light like shining through the water column, and where fish need light, and so do plants, right? And so if it's super turbid and plants aren't getting that sunlight, it's very hard for them to grow, and same with fish. It also affects fish gills, and it has a really big impact on fish eggs and macroinvertebrates and how they grow and get bigger. So factors that affect turbidity are erosion, like logging, farming, natural events, urban runoff. You'll see the N that's right next to that. That is indicating to you all that urban runoff is a non-point pollution source. So what non-point pollution means is basically you cannot detect where the runoff or where the pollutant is infiltrating into the system. Where point pollution, you can actually point out, oh, it's coming from this source going into our streams, like a pipe per se. You also have algae blooms, and then disturbance of bottom sediments can play a huge factor in turbidity as well. Moving along to pH. pH honestly can be found anywhere. It can be found in our soils, it can be found in our stomachs, and then obviously it can be found in our streams. So essentially pH, what we're looking for is we're measuring the hydrogen ions concentration within the water. And why it's important is because aquatic organisms can be very sensitive to high or low pH. So with water that has more free hydrogen ions, it actually becomes more acidic. Whereas water that has more hydroxyl Ions is more basic or alkaline. And so that's really important to kind of take into note for organisms and how they grow. And it's also really important because the lower pHs can actually increase the bioavailability of certain elements like metals. So fish actually can absorb metals within the streams through their gills and through their tissues. And if you think about it, humans eat fish, so we're also consuming those metals. So if we have really low pHs, it's not necessarily only bad for fish, it's also bad for us who consume fish. So another really fun question is, what is the most ideal pH for salmon? You have A, 1 to 2, B, 6 to 8, C, 7, D, 12 to 14, or E, 5 to 7. So if you look upon the pH reader, I'll give you a minute to think about it. And when I say a minute, I mean more like 10 seconds, right? So if you guessed B, between 6 and 8, you would be correct. And technically, it's actually between 6.5 and 8.5, but I like to do a bigger generalization, right? And so in this middle section where it's neutral, that is fish and salmon and aquatic species. That is their happy place. And that's where we want to keep them for years and years to come. So what factors that can affect pH are photosynthesis from plants, respiration, decomposition, agriculture and urban runoff, non-point pollution source, and illegal discharge, which is point. So you have, like I mentioned, like industrial pipes that are pumping out their waste into streams or larger bodies of water, or you could have someone who rolls up in their truck, dumps some type of chemical in there or some substance. That would also be part of point pollution as well. We also measure for temperature. So we do air temperature and water temperature, just to kind of determine how both are, because water temperature is affected by air temperature. So we kind of like to see how both are doing. And it's important because fish and other aquatic organisms have a specific range that they can actually live within. And if it's too high or too low, that's when, survival of the fittest begins to occur and death rates actually increase. So the amount of oxygen water can hold is affected by temperature of the water. So I don't know if you all remember back when I was talking about dissolved oxygen can be affected by temperature. So that's something to also keep in mind. And then sensitivity to pollution is affected by temperature of water as well. So factors that can affect temperature are presence or absence of riparian vegetation. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but essentially the more trees and native species that you have on your riparian buffer, the more shade it will increase for your stream to allow your stream to be cooler so that salmon can actually survive and other aquatic species can survive in those waterways. Erosion, flow, time of day also all affect temperature. And then discharge from pond, dam, or wastewater treatment plant. Now I did put a P next to it, which means point pollution, but I will say this, wastewater treatment plants, it's easy to determine where it's coming from, but pond or dam could be a little bit more tricky. So make sure you keep that in mind when you're thinking about point and non-point pollution. And then last but not least of our chemical parameters that we measure for nitrate, nitrogen. So essentially this is the inorganic form of nitrogen. And there are many different ways that that nitrogen can actually flow into a stream. And it's important because nutrients are necessary for life, but too much of the nutrients can create really suffocating environments for these species. It can increase plant growth, and then it can also increase decay. So something to keep in mind is the process of eutrophication. To simply put eutrophication, it's essentially what I just said, the increase of nutrients in water, which causes excessive plant growth, right? If you think about, you put fertilizer on your crops, right? They're going to be like, yay, happy me, and they're going to want to grow. Same thing is, so there's an abundance of nitrogen or nitrate in the stream. All the plants that are within a stream are going to want to grow. And then those plants actually steal the oxygen from the water so that it makes it really difficult for salmon, fish, macroinvertebrates to breathe and then, or to get oxygen in. And then this causes fish and other aquatic life to die. And this is where you have fish kills. And a great example of a fish kill is the Gulf of Mexico, right? It's one of the most famous ones that you can talk about. You'll hear it if you go to college, all professors talk about the Gulf of Mexico and the fish kill down there. And it's due to the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River runs along many different farming states, actually, and it runs out to the Gulf of Mexico. When you think of farming, you think of chemicals and fertilizer, right? All that fertilizer on those farms actually run off into the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River carries it down to the Gulf of Mexico, where then you have a big body of water and fish are actually dying off all the time. So it's a really big issue. So a great example of what eutrophication can actually cause in bigger events. So factors that affect nitrate, you have sewage and septic tank system leaks, and that is a point pollution because you can actually detect it. You have fertilizer, and then you also have runoff from yards, pastures, and roads. Like I was just talking about runoff from farms with the fertilizer. So now Lake is actually going to take over and talk to you about the biological factor of stream health.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. You covered a lot of the eutrophication and algal blooms. So that's awesome. Yeah, I guess really quick, I actually have a background in stream ecology from my days in college, where this is a picture of me and my friend Leslie. We're out sampling water quality, and we also sampled other things like microinvertebrates and environmental DNA, just to see how our watershed was doing and things that we can do to make it better. So you want to switch the slide? Like Amy was talking about, there's the physical parts of the stream that affect wildlife, and then there's chemical, and then there's biological too. We're actually looking at what's living in the streams. So one of the main ones that we use and the easier ones to detect water quality is macroinvertebrates. And so these are creatures that live in our freshwater ecosystems, and they have no backbone, so they're invertebrates, and they're also, you're able to see them with your eyes. You don't need a microscope to see them. So if you went out to a local stream nearby and got your net and like shoveled a little bit from the bottom of the stream, the benthic area, you might be able to see some of these critters. And I'll actually show a video of like our sampling process so you can see them up close. But there's so many different kinds, and they're all very unique, and they have different tolerances to pollution. And so one of the fun ones that I like telling people about is caddisflies. They're really cool because they live in streams, and some of them are free living, so they don't, they just kind of look like that picture where there's nothing around them. And other ones, they build cases to protect themselves from predators or just the rough and tumble of a riparian area. And so they can build these cases. They use silk and take whatever's in the stream. Sometimes it's pebbles, sometimes it's bark or other leafy material. Then they create these cases. And so someone actually, an artist, decided to put these caddisflies in a little freshwater tank and give them gold and other jewels to live in, and actually created these cases. You can see on the screen, there's some with like gold and pearls, or some with rubies and turquoise. So I think it's really cool that these creatures can do that, and then that someone had the idea to make it into an art form. But actually, do you want to go to the next slide really quick, and then I'll show a quick video about macroinvertebrates. So we have our identification key. On the Envirothon test, you will want to know a few of them and just how pollution intolerant or tolerant they are. And so if you look this up, you can see the different types that you'll find in pretty much any area in Washington. Things like mayflies, caddisflies, like we were talking about, or Dobson fly larvae, maybe damselflies and scuds, which kind of look like really tiny shrimp. They're pretty cool. And so each of these, depending on what category they're in, they will be either really like strong, doesn't matter what kind of pollution you throw at them, they'll survive. And some of them are really sensitive. So even if there's just like a little bit of pollution, they'll struggle in their life cycle. So make sure you know a couple of them just as you prepare for the test. And some of them are just cool to know. You might be able to identify them if you see them in the streams. Actually, do you mind stopping your share and I'll share mine really quick just to show?
Yeah.
I have a short video of me and my coworker, Chris. We were out sampling some macroinvertebrates. And so we want to show you a couple up close. Okay, I think there's only music in the background. I don't know if I shared the sound, but yeah, and we can link that if you want to watch the full video. But there's a lot of different kinds of these macroinvertebrates, and it's really cool to see because they are really important. They tell us about water quality. So if you find a certain amount of the really pollution intolerant ones, so that means they're really sensitive. If there's a lot of them, then it's like, oh, good, it's a healthy stream because they're all thriving. But if you find mostly things like worms, leeches, snails, you know that the stream might not be doing so well, or that freshwater body might not be doing so well because the more sensitive ones aren't able to survive there. So they're really good for detecting water quality. And then they're also really important food sources for native salmon populations and other fish populations. They feed on these as they're getting bigger and getting ready to go out to the ocean. And so if they aren't able to find enough food and they're heading out to the ocean, they're more likely to not survive. The ocean's a big, kind of scary place. So they need all of their good protein and need to build up to get ready to go out there. So yeah, do you want to hit the next slide? Yeah, so this next part, Amy actually talked quite a bit about, and there's a little diagram if you want to see a little more in depth of how it works. Biology is another biological component to stream health. Like Amy was talking about, if there's too many nutrients coming off from maybe erosion or fertilizer from lawns or gardens or farms, that'll come into our stream ecosystems and our freshwater ecosystems, and that will make it so algae can bloom and grow, and they create these like big green patches. But then once they die, all of those all those organisms that break down detritus and other decaying things, they take up the oxygen that's in the stream, and then that leaves not much for the fish, and you get those fish kills. So that's one thing. We definitely want to avoid that, and we also know that it affects the macroinvertebrates and other organisms in the stream too. Go to the next one.
Great. Thanks,
Okay.
Leica, for that explanation.
Yeah.
That was amazing. It's always fun getting to see which macroinvertebrates are tolerant and intolerant to pollution, and that can also determine stream health. So it's very cool. Last but not least, we'll jump into physical and the physical factors that affect stream health and play a part into that. So there are many different things that we look for. We look for the channel structure, the flow of the stream, the substrate. So basically what's on the bottom of the stream, rock, mud, and then the riparian zone as well. So we did talk about riparian zone a teeny bit, but let's dive a little bit deeper into the riparian zone. So this basically, this zone is basically is an area between the stream and then the upland areas. So it's basically adjacent to both of those. And riparian actually comes from the Latin word ripa, which means riverbank, which is really cool. I mean, obviously it shows right into that, how that word got created. And because of the riparian zones can flood, the vegetation that grows there must be able to tolerate having its roots wet occasionally. So if we think about, you know, our home and our landscapes and what kind of plants that we have in our yards, we want plants that are, you know, native, that are going to do well, use less water, and really stabilize the soil. And that kind of plays a really big part into, you know, our wildlife and our outdoors spaces. We want native vegetation to be there as well. It helps, again, use less water, but also helps stabilize our banks. So we want to like trees and shrubbery around our streams so that it creates that shade, like I said, for salmon and other aquatic life to live in a nice, cool stream. So a perfect example, we talked a lot about like pollutants that can affect their stream health, but there are actually plants that can affect our stream health. And one of them is called knotweed. And knotweed, there's 3 different types of species we have here in Western Washington. We have Bohemian, we have Japanese, and we have giant. They all look similar. I swear, like it's very hard to tell them apart. The only nice thing about giant knotweed is that it says in its name, it has really, really large leaves compared to the other 2. But same structure of the leaf. It's a nice heart-shaped structure, has little tiny white clusters of flowers. And you will mainly see this plant along streams because they love their roots to be saturated at all times with water. You can see knotweed growing in other areas as well, a little bit more drier areas, but very uncommon. They love water. And so this plant was an ornamental plant for a very long time, and people loved growing it in their gardens and on their landscapes. But guess what? It's an invasive species, and it loves Western Washington, but loves it way too much and actually shades out all native vegetation to be able to grow near our streams. And so when these plants are perennial plants. And so basically what that means is that they die off in the winter and then they come back in the spring/summertime. And so during the winter, knotweed does not have they have a complex root system, but it's a very weak complex root system, right? And what that means is that they don't stabilize our banks very well. And so when they die off in the winter, guess what happens? Erosion occurs on the stream banks, and it continues to widen and widen and widen our streams ever so more. And so it's really crucial. There's been a lot of organizations that have been tackling knotweed along riverways because this plant does not allow anything else to grow in there. And this plant also does not shade our streams well enough for our streams to be nice and cool and habitable places for salmon and aquatic life. So very important that it can affect the temperature of our streams. It also can affect the flow of our streams, and it can actually affect the structure of our streams. So just something else to think about. It's not just chemical and pollutants that harm our health of our streams. It's also plants like knotweed. So how we as a stream team make sure that knotweed in particular is not growing near our streams. As we ask our monitors once a year around early summer or late summer, early fall, to do a habitat assessment. And basically this is for us to get a better glimpse as to what is happening within the streams itself, but also the stream surrounding. So they look at the stream, they look at the structure, but then they also look at the vegetation that's growing along that riparian buffer or zone near the stream. And it helps us continue to bring the information back to our jurisdictional partners, like I was mentioning earlier in this presentation, so that they can help us tackle if knotweed were to be there or another thing were to be happening. Another thing that this is the last thing that we look for when it comes to our stream team program, and we actually collect data from, is called stream discharge or flow. We talked about flow a lot. That's basically the same thing as stream discharge. So stream discharge is the total volume of water in the stream flowing past a location. So you pick a point and then you will perform this measurement. It basically is a function of the cross-sectional area. So the width, as you can see at the bottom picture, we're measuring the width, and the depth, as you can see, and this is actually my boss, Belinda, and you can see her measuring how deep the stream is, and then the velocity. So a really fun fact about this measurement is that our monitors only measure for this for stream discharge between May 1st and September 30th. And the reason for that, drum roll please, is because of salmon spawning. So salmon spawn, not exactly, but we give them a period of time between October 1st and April 30th. So during that time, salmon are coming back to their streams, they're laying their redds, right? And this measurement, like stream discharge, makes us have to go into the streams, tromping around, right? We have to measure the width, we have to get the depth. And so it's not the most like salmon friendly or red friendly type of measurement to be performing during that time. So we ask our monitors to never collect stream discharge or flow from October 1st to April 30th. But from May 1st to September 30th, it's all game. And today actually marks the first day. Happy May Day. And they'll be going out and starting to do those measurements very soon. So the salmon that we're looking for that we have all around the Pacific Northwest, these ones are going to be chum, coho, chinook, sockeye, pink, steelhead, and cutthroat. So these ones are all, these salmon are found all around the Pacific Northwest, and we have to make sure that we're protecting them and their redds so that we can increase those populations. So now if there's any questions, we can take it. Thank you all so much for sitting in on our presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect.
All right. Okay, so no questions. And then if there's any questions about the Envirothon competition in general, we'll be sending out a frequently asked questions sheet so you can prepare for all of your competition events and Zoom meetings. So hopefully this was helpful to your studies as you go into the competition and maybe even for those competing next year and years after. But thank you so much for joining. We'll see you soon.